Welcome back for another episode of the TechSpective podcast. My guest this week is my friend Ron Gula. So, you know, you and I interviewed you like way back when. We've known each other for many years. Eventually, I did come to work, for you at Tenable, and now here we are. Life moves on. But you. After kind of leaving your day-to-day duties at Tenable, you've created Gula Tech, and you're out there. I follow what you're doing, and I see kind of the investments that you're making, and the grant program that you're running, and I really appreciate the sort of giving back to the community and investing in the community. And part of the reason that I wanted to have you on and have this conversation today is I wanted to talk about, what you see out there that's innovative, like what's coming, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense to just invest in more of the same, to invest in a startup that's just doing the same thing as a company that already exists, but with a different name.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come on again and talk about it. So Gula Tech Adventures, we're very focused on protecting the nation. We'll call it the free world if you want, with the right cyber technology and the right cyber workforce. So we're very focused on getting the right technology out there and getting more people into this career field. And we have a number of levers that we pull. We invest in technologies and then work on those organizations, their go-to-market strategies, their boards, their M&A. We do grants. We do competitive grants where we actually put a problem out there and we ask people to apply, and we treat them almost like companies, if you will, who's the most competitive or who's the most effective at doing these things. And both of those together, it gives us a lot of ability to then go talk about public policy. We support a lot of different, go-to-markets with public policy, both with, directly talking to politicians and also working at places such as the Wilson Center or Defending Digital campaigns, where it puts us in a lot of contact with, bipartisan approaches for cybersecurity. And I think the really interesting thing about what we're doing is like it's all related. When we invest in a company, something like CyberArray, they got 3 million people that they've gotten into the business, they've given certifications to. It gives us a lot of perspective when we're showing up to like maybe an Aspen Institute conference on diversity, equity, and inclusion in trying to diversify the cyber workforce. And that everything we do is very, very related. So we call it an adventure, even though we have a venture capital arm and we have the foundation arm. And happy to talk about any of those types of technologies or some of the nonprofits that we've been working with.
Okay. Yeah, because like I said, I've been in cybersecurity and writing about cybersecurity for 20 years now, and some household brands or whatever have been around that whole time. You're on the technology side, the Microsofts, the Intels, the Apples. On a security side, the McAfee's and the semantics, although they seem to be sort of fading a little bit now as they kind of get acquired and spun off and reacquired and things like that. But they're on the one hand, it seems like a lot of cybersecurity seems to just be merry-go-round or whatever. We new products come out and we don't seem to be making significant progress. But I will caveat that with, and I've mentioned this before on previous episodes, that the bar has also increased. The threat landscape has expanded. The volume of devices that need to be protected has grown by orders of magnitude, and so to say that we haven't made any progress would be false. I think we keep making progress, and the threat keeps making progress as well. And therein lies the challenge, which is finding innovative solutions that can kind of get us ahead of that curve and one step ahead of that threat landscape, and hopefully in a sustainable way, like like in a not just a we're going to keep leapfrogging each other indefinitely, but it would be amazing to find a technology solution, a cybersecurity solution that actually, ending would be a very strong word. Like, I don't think you could ever end the threat, but significantly.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, the cyber industry is not like the airline industry. The airline industry is heavily regulated. We all fly around on very similar airplanes, and we all have a very similar experience. On the internet, though, your network, my network, our home networks are likely different. Tenable's internal network, where we both worked at, was probably a lot different than Qualys. So there's a lot of variations that go out there. And when you look at even things like public companies, hear about something like a bank like JP Morgan have $500 million cybersecurity budget. It was only 20 years ago that public boards were required to have financial experts join their thing. That was due to Sarbanes-Oxley. There's no requirement for a cyber committee. There's no requirement for these public boards. There's a total lack of visibility from the boards of people paying attention to these issues. So no wonder something like Colonial Pipeline can go undetected for a while, or when it happens, it's catastrophic, because people don't look at these things like from a systemic risk point of view. They look at them from let's sprinkle hygiene and hunting. And don't get me wrong, I always want more hygiene, I always want more hunting, but these organizations out there are not approaching things from a systemic risk point of view. Now, specifically with investments, there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of what we try to do at Gula Tech Adventures is invest in solid engineering. Granted, there's always more hygiene, there's always better ways to hunt people, but we have to get to engineering solutions. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of our investments is Trinity Cyber. It'd be great to have every internet connection protected with this company, because they literally can look inside all of the files, whether it's a GIF or a Word doc, and literally remove malicious content in a transparent manner, in such a way that a coffee shop, a small university, or whatever doesn't have to have a SOC and doesn't have to have those kind of things. That's a kind of engineering solution that's pretty good. There's other companies out there like Scythe. How do you really know when you've done enough compliance and done enough hunting? Well, take a QA approach, right? Before an airplane takes off, you have to go through these checklists. Well, before you have authority to operate, why don't you make some implants with Scythe, make some malware, simulate DarkSide, put it on the network, see how long it takes to find it. This is something Dmitry Operovich has been pushing for the last couple of years. How long can you actually find something like that? And then lastly, if you want to actually have secure communications, that technology exists. If people are using email and corresponding with other people, they have a host of issues like with phishing and with executables coming in. Why not think about replacing something like email with perhaps a Slack competitor and something you can control the crypto with? And we have companies in that space called Highside, and it's a Slack, Zoom, Teams sort of competitor, but it allows small business and large enterprise to do that. So these are companies that we invest in. There's a whole. We're not going to talk about all of them. We probably have about 100 companies that we're working with, either directly or indirectly. But every one of them, we've got some sort of engineering focus on how these technologies can protect my mom and dad, the nation, big DoD networks, because the threat is just that big.
Yeah, well, when you talk about your mom and dad and stuff, what's one of the things that's I often have to remind myself of and kind of step back is, I have a cybersecurity background. You have a cybersecurity background. So things that make sense to me and the way that my brain works when I see an email come in or just see anything online is different than my brother or my father or my mother-in-law. And it's also true, even working in a cybersecurity company, there are people who are the cybersecurity side of that, but then there's just the company side of that. There are people in accounting and people in, wherever who just aren't security minded. That's not their background. And the solutions that we create, the technologies we put in place need to be able to protect them. Like I had a conversation many years ago with various security experts about like, well, what are you running on your computer for anti-malware endpoint protection? And a lot of them, the answer was nothing. And yet they were more secure and didn't get compromised by anything. Meanwhile, I have family members who are running 2 and 3 different security software solutions on their computers and are getting compromised all the damn time.
Yeah, it's definitely a tapestry. So a lot of times when we look at problems, we want to find more than one way to solve it. So one of our investments in the phishing issue is Inky. Now, Inky is a enterprise phishing business email compromise solution. They use AI, computer vision to stop potential bad things coming in for your corporate email. It doesn't do anything for Slack, doesn't do anything for your personal email, which we think is a big threat. So we invested in another company called Pixm, Pixm. They have a browser plugin. Anytime you're about to log on, now think of my mom and dad, right? Anytime they're about to log on to something that looks like Facebook, it basically checks the URL, the certificate, that sort of thing, and it says, hey, that thing really looks like Facebook. It's not coming from an IP address or domain name that we're. Don't click on that. It's probably phishing. And a tool like that is the right kind of thing that you need to give to the general public, people who don't have a cybersecurity background, or frankly, you or I are experts, but in a moment of weakness, when you're distracted and you're targeted, you might really appreciate a banner, coming up saying, hey, don't click on that. And we need more solutions like that to solve these sort of social problems of lack of training and awareness, because we didn't learn the fact that, the internet is a hostile place, and we really need to defend ourselves from the information coming at us 24/7.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious, like, as in the position that you're in, as the venture capital investor and sort of consultant in some ways to all of these companies that you're working with in your portfolio, do you encourage or do you encourage them to collaborate or work together in any way? Because one of the things I'm noticing more of, even from top tier Fortune 500 cybersecurity vendors and the U.S. government in general, is a much bigger focus on this problem is bigger than any one of us, and that as great as I might think my product is, I'm not so narcissistic as to think that is the sole solution to all of our cybersecurity woes, and that we have to cooperate and work together on this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of interoperability that we've been pushing. So, for example, Trinity Cyber, it can rapidly look at documents and files and remove malicious content, almost like a sandbox, but more or less instant. With zero latency, 40 milliseconds, that sort of thing. So, Inky is actually sending their attachments through Trinity right now, which is actually a pretty cool relation. We had another company, Racktop Systems. Racktops has a way to do large-scale petabytes of like enterprise file storage area network attached storage, that sort of thing, except they have everything you ever want built in to control the crypto, the high availability of that. And they also detect and stop crypto ransomware and that. So they were building a malware lab, and I said, hey, that's great. Maybe you should just buy a copy of Scythe, simulate DarkSide, simulate crypto ransomware, and do that. And I just, there's so many different things like that can be done. Those are some of the ones that came to mind. Cyber is another one. I mean, anybody who's got online training, if you can get on that Cyber platform, you're going to expose yourself to a much larger market of potential customers, but also people who are entering the career field and want to know what the latest and greatest commercial certifications and commercial technologies are out there.
Okay. I lost my train, but I do think I know what I was going to say. I was going to say that one of the other things that I've been aware of for a while, but again notice more as life goes on, is you have a background with the government and the military. Other people that we know do, and I've actually noticed that a number of cybersecurity companies are founded by people who are ex NSA or ex US military intelligence or ex other nations military intelligence, and it's lately it seems more and more that the line between what is a nation state attack and what is a cybercrime attack gets blurrier and blurrier, especially with our primary adversaries, with being Russia and China in that realm. It's kind of hard to tell. Okay, well, what is that a Chinese cybercrime group, or was that the Chinese government, or all of these attacks from SolarWinds to DarkSide to now, this JBS or whatever meatpacking. Which apparently they've now said is the Revel ransomware, which is another one out of Russia. Does that background help? Does it help bring insight in terms of like, well, we know kind of how nation states approach cybersecurity and cyber espionage, and therefore we have insight into like how to try to address this issue.
So with my own personal background, learning cybersecurity while working at the National Security Agency, you talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, people who basically invented, how do you talk about, nobody talked about it as cybersecurity. They talk about information security, information engineering, the Orange Book, the different types of NIST standards when it comes to how cryptography works. So I had a lot of that experience, and a lot of people who are coming out of Cyber Command and starting companies these days, coming out of the NSA Computer Directorate and starting companies these days, and that's definitely a good thing. For larger organizations, larger federal organizations who are subject to basically auditing, maybe by DHS or NIST, they are being audited against some very, very critical standards out there. That really sets the tone for how commercial organizations are supposed to defend themselves. But if you look at it, a commercial organization doesn't have knowledge of satellite overhead reconnaissance. They don't have knowledge of, insiders who are walking into embassies and giving up information about, disinformation campaigns or, targeting that's out there. So the government always has more resources than the private sector. The government has SCIFs. Very few people have SCIFs out there, for example. So the government really has shown people what's the art of possible really is. So the question is what is security? When you get out in the private sector, what is enough?
All right. Do you have any thoughts on, I don't want to turn this into a international geopolitical conversation per se, but there has been it seems a rise in cyber, a rise in tension on like the cyber Cold War front between the United States and Russia. Now, there's a degree of plausible deniability in that DarkSide is is viewed as a cybercrime group that is not part of the Russian government per se. Revel is the same thing. So they have these cybercrime groups that are behind these ransomware attacks, but they're operating, with relative impunity out of Russia. So it seems to me like there, even if Russia isn't pulling the strings and Russia isn't saying, "Hey, go attack the Colonial Pipeline," they also aren't stopping them.
Yeah, we live in we live in the world of science fiction. I mean, it's these cyber attacks are going on. We don't know who's taking action against them. And we even have, space warfare and directed energy weapons, target against, American, government people in Cuba and perhaps even in DC. Who can make up, this kind of stuff? So when it comes to cyber, it might be crypto ransomware. It might be the modern equivalent of pirates or the mob. But those mob and pirate organizations do indeed operate, at the pleasure of their host countries. So the question is how much action is going on in cyberspace? Can we talk about? Like, let's assume Cyber Command or the NSA, did some sort of attack against DarkSide. Maybe that's something that, they're just going to serve in silence and do their job and be very satisfied that they're protecting the country. On the other hand, if we're going to do a UFO commission and Congress is going to release about the latest UFOs, I think the American public can handle what we are and are not doing in cyberspace.
Yeah. One of the things too that doesn't come up that often, but every once in a while I step back and I say, you know what, as much as I feel personally threatened or personally attacked because these Russian or Chinese entities are executing these cyber attacks against U.S. interests, I do kind of sit there and go, we're probably doing the same. I mean, I don't have any direct knowledge of it. I don't know what the United States is doing, but I wouldn't be surprised to learn that the United States is also doing similar operations in Russia and China. So we're not innocent in that. I don't think. Again, I have no direct knowledge of it, but I assume that we are also engaged in similar activities.
Well, imagine your job in the U.S. military is to defeat, a Chinese air squadron or a Chinese, naval flotilla or a Chinese hypersonic weapon, or change that to Russia, change that to Iran. And let's say the only thing you have is the fact that they haven't patched some vulnerability in an FTP server that somebody has access to because they're in line of sight from the special forces. Some of these cyber weapons, it's literally like you press a button and then the plane doesn't take off, or you can take over the airplane. And let's assume that technology exists. That would be highly classified, and we shouldn't talk about that. But at the same time, I think if people are coming at us with techniques, my hat's off to people like the NSA who've come out and said, here's the actual 20 or so techniques, the CVEs, the specific CVEs that China's using to target American business. That's great transparency, and that's a really, really good thing to share. But it's hard for the general public to differentiate like a really magical cyber attack that comes from aliens in the future with not patching a system and just having access to it.
True. What do you think is, what's the next step? Like where do we need to go in terms of cybersecurity as an industry to try to get ahead of all of that? And again, with the blurred line between nation state and cyber criminal, it seems like the stakes are higher.
So so in America, there's a very, very high level concept. So we need to have transparency, and we have so much transparency in our financial system. We have transparency in our voting process. We have transparency in the way airplanes move around. We need to have transparency in our cybersecurity. And there's a lot of elephants in the room that just are not there. The government is not protecting small business. The government's not protecting big business. They're a deterrent, and they're doing it, but it's really up to the commercial sector to defend themselves. And I'm really happy with people like Keith Alexander, General Alexander, who are talking about a public-private partnership where in some cases, the private sector can inform the government about attacks that the government's not aware of, specifically FireEye's discovery of Solarwinds, for example. We need to encourage those kind of things and not discourage reporting. At the same time, I'm really encouraged that the government is spending more money on cybersecurity. I think the Biden administration is proposing $20 billion of new spending for CISA and the DoD. The most of it's going to the DoD. I would really encourage, the more we think about spending, the more we focus on engineering and not just more hygiene and more hunting. Now, don't get me wrong, more hygiene is always going to help. More hunting is always going to help. But as an industry, we have a hard way of prioritizing. Is a 16-character password better than a 15-character password? Well, yes, absolutely it is. But are there other systemic things that need to be fixed? So I really, really want to push organizations who are receiving capital to focus on engineering a long-term solution to the security of the data that they're protecting. Otherwise, if you just double down on hygiene and hunting, your adversary is just going to double down on their offensive methods, and then we're going to have the same sort of stalemate that we have now. So I really, really want to see much more adoption of security engineering across the board.
You talked about like the information sharing and like with FireEye, sharing that information. That was great. I've talked often about the attack that Google suffered in China. I think it was like 2012-ish, and how they did the same thing. Like Google went public with, hey, here are the indicators of compromise that we have that show that this seems to be coming from China. And then all of a sudden everyone else came out of the woodwork. It's like a lot of people were seeing things, they just weren't sharing it. And Google kind of opened the floodgate, and then everyone shared, and that was great. And then it kind of stopped a little bit. But I do think, we have all these like industry specific ISACs, where they are, collaborating, within the banking industry, within the, whatever, so that they are at least comparing notes on some level. But I do agree, or I do think that we should have that on a more global level, like not just industry specific, but cross industry sharing of information on a more regular basis. Because I've drawn the analogy many times of, it's like having a jigsaw puzzle, and there's 1,000 pieces in the puzzle, but the intelligence you have is just 5 pieces, and then that company has 10 pieces, and those guys over there have 4 pieces, but you have no idea what the end puzzle is supposed to look like or how the pieces fit together unless you all sit down at a table and put your pieces on the table and see how they fit.
What's really interesting about the threat intelligence conversation is that when are you done? In other words, you and I, we put out a report, we started a threat intelligence company, and we find this one IP address in China, in Mississippi, in Canada, it doesn't matter. This is a malicious IP address. Here's all our evidence, and we publish it out. So then the question is then, okay, now if I define my security as I want to have all the threat intelligence, how many threat intelligence vendors do you need to buy where you've got all of the threat? And then the question is how much does the government know? What's that gap between everything in the private sector and everything in the government? That would be a really interesting thing to know from a public policy point of view. Having said that, though, CERT actually did a study on this, and they actually said you had to buy something like 88, 99 different threat feeds to get close to 90% of all the unique IP addresses and DNSs out there. And I put a blog entry at gula.tech about this, and this is dated probably about 3-4 years ago, because the problem is now you have this burden. There's like a 50 million, 100 million, different IP addresses. Just IP addresses alone, they're doing really, really bad things. And people like Recorded Future, they give away their like top 100,000. A lot of times you have a firewalls and you say, let me just block that. I want to disconnect that from the internet. You can't go to like a Palo Alto or a Cisco and drop that in, which is one of the reasons we invested in this company called Bandura, where you can actually just come in and try to block all of that, all that kind of stuff. But that is just one strategy. Having good security engineering where you don't have the ability to exploit, you remove certain things. Things like we don't have an investment in this space, but this is an example of security engineering. Browser isolation. If you can literally isolate your employees from the internet traffic that they're sharing, that's great. And it's a good example of security engineering that doesn't take any threat intelligence at all to protect yourself from all of those threats.
Yeah. No, I've actually worked with a couple different browser isolation vendors, so that is an interesting space. I also like the deception space, honestly. I've had sort of philosophical debates with a couple of deception vendors where I'm like, because some of them seem very sensitive if you say that it's like a honeypot, and I'm like, okay, but it is. like you're kind of doing the same thing on a different level, different scale. But I mean, I like the idea because for whether you're talking about an external threat or an insider threat, which might even not be malicious, but people get curious, they have access, they start poking around where they shouldn't. And when you have this decoy asset on your network or whatever, that's an automatic red flag. If anything connects to this, then okay, well, whatever the reason is, it's not good. It's not valid. There's no valid reason to connect to that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of deception. And, one of the things Marty Roche and I worked on at BBN was honeypots. This is like the late, mid 90s, if you will. And then you had Mantrap, which was acquired by Symantec. And they used the Solaris, operating system to have this is before virtualization was like a really big deal. And now, if you look at things like Ativo networks, you look at things like Trust Labs, They have made honeypots, honey tokens, honey docs, honey users, honey crumb trails, honey this, honey that. They've made it really easy, and they've made it, basically acceptable. Most of these companies list Fortune 20, Fortune 200, in their list of customers. And the funny thing is, if you talk about, well, I'm a big national bank, and I'm going to put honey tokens in my documents, and this stuff shows up with a hacking group, well, that's kind of like hackback. That's kind of like you're doing cyber offense against people who are hacking you. And I think we're doing these kind of things already, and people don't realize that this is just the modern form of defense.
Yeah. It is interesting, the technologies like that. So whether it's deception, whether it's the browser isolation, I think those are examples of sort of newer technologies that you have kind of come to the mainstream in recent years, and eventually they either gain traction and become things of their own, or they end up getting acquired by larger companies who say, you know what, yeah, deception's a cool thing, let's roll that into what we're doing. So those are.
I'll give you another.
You go ahead.
It's another good engineering one is this concept of whitelisting. And the basic concept is you have some sort of process on your computer that controls what software can run. And if new software tries to run, it'll shoot it down. It's a brilliant concept, very simple to articulate, very hard to do in practice. Because how do you define software? If I have Adobe and they come out with a patch, well, that technically is new software. So do you do it by the certificate of the code that's being signed? Well, that can be faked. Do you do it by understanding what's normal about that thing and alerting when it behaves differently? These are very difficult things. But in practice, we don't teach the general public the decisions that they're making that expose them. So if you've set up a Windows computer recently, Windows 10, the first time you go to install Zoom or a non-Microsoft kind of app, it says, do you really want to do this? Because right now we ship you a version of the operating system that can only run Windows software. And that's a good level of security engineering. I mean, right away, you are basically having the ability to limit a vast quantity of malware just with that simple policy. As soon as you open it up and say anything goes, you're sort of taking a car out without a seatbelt or turning the airbags off. And we're not doing a good job teaching the general public that these technologies exist, and they're making these bargains with future malware that they're letting into their network.
Right. It is interesting because the way Windows 10 ships is sort of like they're shipping it to you under sort of the Apple model of saying, here's our operating system, and you can use the apps from our store that we have vetted, and we're giving it some sort of seal of approval. We're not guaranteeing that it's secure, but at least someone has looked at it. And then you have the ability to flip that switch and basically go to the Android model of no holds barred. You can do whatever you want, download all the software, and that's on you. So you have an either or situation.
And it's almost like we need, the smoking labels on cigarettes, like this could cause cancer. Like you almost really need to have those kind of labels for the general public, because you or I, as cyber people, cyber wonks, I mean, we can talk and pontificate about, oh yeah, it's kind of cool and whatnot. Kids in school, my parents, senior citizens, they have no idea. It's just crazy that we don't really have more education for that.
Yeah. And one of the other things is traditionally, like the model of cybersecurity for many years has been, it's reactive. It's the attacker always gets the first move, and then we figure out how to defend against that. That's the whole model of signature-based security solutions. Is before you can create the signature, the threat has to exist, and you have to discover it. And now more, this has always been the case, but even more so now, that's not really good enough. And it comes back to what you were talking about, that we need better engineering, because we need to be proactive, not reactive with security. I mean, if you look at the way ransomware is now, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they came in, they encrypted your data, they said, give us some money. And the guidance was, well, don't pay the ransom, just do a better job of backing up your data so you could tell them to go jump in a lake, you restore from backup, and you're back up and running, no problem. Well, the ransomware groups have said, okay, we can play with that model. We're going to first take your data, then we're going to encrypt your data and ask for the ransom, but we're going to add the additional incentive that if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to leak your data, sell your data, expose your data. So now your backups no longer protect you from the ransomware. So now all of a sudden, if you're Apple, Acer, who were both hit with $50 million ransom demands this year, and I don't know if they paid or didn't pay or negotiated a different deal, or I have no idea what the outcome of that was. But if the ransomware attacker says, look, I have all of your intellectual property and I'm going to release it publicly if you don't pay this ransom, if you're Apple and you're sitting on $100 billion or whatever of cash, why wouldn't you pay the ransom?
I think it's really interesting. So when you think about someone's going after your backups that are not encrypted, and you look at somebody who says, I don't want to join the cybersecurity field because it's just so technical. I mean, look at all the requirements for like the payment card industry standard. Look at all the requirements for the NIST cybersecurity framework. But somewhere in there, it says, do you do backups and are they encrypted? And that's really no different than when the airplane's getting ready to take off. Do the flaps work? Is the landing gear retract? Do I have a full tank of fuel? People are not associating the fact that running an IT network is really important. It's not just something that you can do haphazardly. So, people are starting to really learn that IT is important, and these standards are out there to do things. The question is are people going to take it seriously enough? Well,
one of the fallout or the responses to Colonial Pipeline is I saw the news story that said that, and it surprised me for a couple reasons, but it said that the TSA is going to require that pipeline companies report when there's a cyber attack. And I thought, A, why does the TSA have jurisdiction over that? I thought they just did security theater at airports. And B, why is that new? Why weren't we already requiring pipelines to report when there was a cyber attack? It's mind-boggling that in 2021 there had to be a major attack for them to say, hey, you know what? Maybe we should know about that when that happens.
Well, if you compare the government's response to COVID with the government's response to cyber, you can really see some difference. So let's say you get the zombie plague and you call your local hospital. Your local hospital will eventually get the fact that, hey, there's a zombie plague. It'll eventually get to the CDC. Whereas with cyber, if you called up your local state police, it might get the eye. It might get somewhere else. Now, if you're sophisticated enough to be an ISAC, where you and other companies, like-minded companies, can share, it might go there. But if you're going to pay a ransomware, maybe you're required to have a license to do that, so the government is aware of that. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing. But right now, when an airplane crashes and we have the National Transportation Safety Board investigate these, there's not like thousands and thousands of different types of airplanes, flying different types of directions and speed. It's pretty well regulated and well controlled. So when something does happen, we can usually find out something that's relevant to everybody else. With cyber, I'm really concerned that, we do need more transparency. I want that. But I'm really concerned that, the Colonial Pipeline hack, the meatpacking hack that occurred recently, and then even just Solarwinds and the Florida, water station hack, they could be all completely different technologies. And someone's going to point to somewhere in the NIST cybersecurity framework or the MITRE ATT&CK framework or the payment card industry and what regulation they could have done to stop it. And it won't be, that have the effect that we want it to have.
Right. Well, and going back to the idea of the kind of public-private cooperation, I feel like as the stakes have increased and as the line has blurred, it becomes more incumbent on the government to take a more active role. Not saying that it's the government's job to protect everybody, but there needs to be cooperation. There needs to be involvement, because the U.S., if Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are launching attacks, that are like a broad spray across the United States infrastructure, and they're hitting U.S. companies, the U.S. government can't just say, well, hey, Joe's manufacturing in Nebraska, that's not our problem. It's like it is our.
You're absolutely right. But Tony, let's say you're president. What are you going to do? Are you going to launch nuclear weapons against cyber attacks? Are you going to do cyber attacks against cyber attacks? Are you going to do economic sanctions? I mean, how many more sanctions can we do against a nation like Russia, for example, to deter the aggression? Or somebody like China, who's one of our biggest trading partners out there, like they build all of our stuff. What's the right policy long term to deter intellectual property, theft, for example, which is completely different than maybe, China supporting Iran, or China supporting North Korea, or China supporting, other types of countries that are not, not aligned with the United States. It's a really interesting issue. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the general public just does not understand cybersecurity. So it doesn't become the political hot button that the Colonial Pipeline did. That's really the first time something in cyber really happened that the general public said, this is something we really need fixed.
Right. Well, so you go from, wait, I can't get gas now, which wasn't really true, but that was the reaction to, wait, I can't get steak now. So now, this is definitely getting the public's attention at this point.
And what I'm hoping it happens is that people understand that they are, whoever you are somebody else's supply chain. So people who are like, oh, I don't want to pay for that extra IT person. I don't want to pay for my managed service provider to do some hunting and hygiene for me, or, oh, I really don't want to upgrade my website and protect it with Cloudflare, whatever it is, that people are going to realize that it's that kind of attitude that they will be the next Colonial Pipeline. They will be the next meatpacking crypto ransomware. They'll be the next city of Baltimore that gets locked down. And it's unfortunate because there's probably a lot more of that's going on that's been infiltrated that hasn't been crypto ransomware, because we're waiting, our adversaries are waiting for the right time and place to cause disruption when it's to their advantage. And
I really wonder about the continued fallout from SolarWinds. So so we just had the revelation during RSA, a week or two ago, that it turns out the SolarWinds compromise happened like 10 months earlier than what was previously thought. And it's like, okay, so what we're saying is the adversary was in the network for like a year and a half, and before they were detected. And it's like, so even after we detected it and we say, okay, well, now we found these things, and we've put out guidance and tools to say, okay, well, you can find these things and remove them or protect against them, but we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what other 0 days have already been planted, what other time bombs exist in the infrastructure that are just waiting to be used at a later date.
Yeah, my concern with the SolarWinds is if it was 100% of a remote internet style attack. Certainly that's very efficient in something like the nation of Russia, and probably other nations could pull off. But the reality is that Intel doesn't really work just that way. They have assets here in the country, and nobody really imagines, the cleaning crew, temp workers, employees possibly being subverted by, foreign intel to target their company. But the reality is, if you have a small number of people who are indeed working, you can make devastating cyber attacks. You can turn a small asset into a huge cyber asset. And this is where I think companies really need to be thinking about their employees, their partnerships, sentiment, understanding all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. When you're talking about China and Russia, like one of the things that it's related but separate. But back when I was in the Air Force, when I was very into the planes. I've got the F-16 over here. I've got an F-111 up over here on my wall. And at one point in time, I knew every bit of data about those jets. Like I could tell you the thrust to weight ratio. I could tell you, the wingspan. Like everything you wanted to know about an F-16, I could tell you. And I always found it interesting that, you look at Chinese aircraft, you look at Russian aircraft, and it's like, there's no way they didn't steal our intellectual property. I mean, the MiG-29 is just an F-15. And actually, I had a conversation with my son recently. He was just talking about the amount of money we invest in Defense Department research and development in general, and how maybe that's not very necessary. And I said, you can almost make an argument that those investments become a double-edged sword, because every time we invent something, the adversary gets it too.
Yeah, I mean, the Soviet Buran, their space shuttle looks a lot like our space shuttle. I mean, I get that, and that's what folks who are lagging behind tend to do. The first person in the room, bumps in the dark room, bumps into all the objects, makes it easier for the second person. But talking about the intellectual property, loss it doesn't really emphasize enough the advantage the United States has of having a transparent society. We have a transparent, democratic society, and we have a lot of institutions that we have a lot of public trust. And a lot of what's going on with Russia and China is they're attacking our institutions. They're making our politicians look, not as sophisticated as they are. They're undermining a lot of our law enforcement. If you don't think some of the, maybe riots and stuff that happened over the summer was flamed on social media, with disinformation, these organizations are against that. And I don't think the American public understands how much Russia and China don't like us as a democracy. And again, once you understand that, you understand the fact that majority of what you see on the internet has been engineered for your eyes, either by people trying to sell you something or trying to deceive, something like that. So I'm happy to talk about trying to limit intellectual property theft, but the bigger struggle is that we have a transparent society going up against these closed societies. And I really want to make sure people understand that and arm themselves against it.
Right. All right. Well, I want to start to wind down, but related to that, and you've got the Star Trek stuff on the shelf behind you. My son and I also often talk about that Star Trek society, and the Federation, and how at some point in the future in science fiction, there's basically two versions. Either it's a complete dystopia, or the world has come together. Basically, countries no longer exist, and there's just a kind of a global government, a global society. And I've noticed lately with most movies that have to do with getting to Mars or interstellar travel, it's always an international coalition. It's always all the countries working together. So when I saw that, China landed a Mars rover, that was kind of one of my first thoughts. Is that almost seems like a waste of resources and stuff. Like the fact that we did it and they did it, like we could have worked together, and maybe we could have gotten there in half the time, or like it just seems silly for us to both launch basically the same mission to Mars.
Yeah, anybody who doesn't think we are in a great power struggle with China, needs to really look at that. I mean, it really is a question for our time, because we are so interconnected with them. They really depend upon us. We really depend upon them. I think a lot of folks in the United States feel like we are very dependent upon China, but you are seeing a lot of manufacturing and businesses coming back to the mainland. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of hope that China is eventually going to become a democratic, country, but likely not. I mean, there's a lot of folks out there who've written on this. General Rob Spalding is pretty much like, look, we can hope all we want. They are not going to switch anytime soon because of the stranglehold they have on their culture and their public. So you're probably going to see a lot more of this great power struggle between America and China. And Russia's, putting their hand in there too, but it's really going to all be about China and the United States.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me. Thank you for taking the time.
Tony, thanks a lot for having me on. Anybody wants to learn more about our foundation or our investments, just go to gula.tech, www.gula.tech.
Awesome. And I will make sure to include the link in the blog post with the podcast. So yeah, take care.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow @TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions that you'd like to see answered in future posts.